जी माइक ये वाला चलना चाहिए. हाँ. इसकी क्या वजह है कि कल जल्दी हो गया था, अभी टाइम दे रहे हैं. नहीं किया था कनेक्ट. वेट नाम से भी ज्यादा होना चाहिए, क्यों? जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. Let me know if you can hear me clearly. Those of you who are online. All right, assalamu alaikum. So we've done, I think, one of the most difficult topics in this course is free will and predestination, one of the most difficult. And we're going to begin with human origins, but before we do that, there's this excerpt I usually read out in all of the classes. So is there anyone here who has read Wonder, this book by R.J. Palacio? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Anyone? You've read the book? Okay. What were your thoughts about it? Did you like it? Okay, so the way that the writer has written the book, it's fiction, but it's based on actual people who are faced with defects, who are born with defects, right? And the way he's written the book is that there are parts written by the different characters. So one of the characters, who is named, if I can find it, just hold on. So there's this boy, I think there's a movie made on it also, right? So there's a movie, I don't know how that is, but the book is really, really good. And I encourage you all to read it. So when we're talking about free will and predestination, and even the topic of why evil is allowed in this world, okay, this book comes to mind. So there's this part in which the character, I think Justin, what was his name? If only I had put a bookmark, wouldn't take so long. Yes, so here's the character Justin, and the boy who is born with a facial defect. So his name is August. Okay, and the story is all about him and his family. Now this character Justin, this one page, 204, just this one page tells you a lot about destiny or predestination. So what does he say? And essentially, I think the book is about how the family grows from this, okay, and how he learns. And it's just something that you have to experience yourself. So you should read it. I recommend it. So he says, page 204, My head is full of thoughts that won't turn off, lines from my monologues, elements from the periodic table that I'm supposed to be memorizing, theorems I'm supposed to be understanding, and then Augie. Augie is the name, is the nickname of August. Okay? Miranda's words kept coming back. The universe was not kind to Augie Pullman. Now, universe, you can take it as God as well. So who has, it really depends. What is your worldview? If you believe in God, then anything that happens in your life, you're going to take it to God, right? And if you're just talking about the universe, which he is, so he says that the universe has not been very kind to August. What did that little kid ever do to deserve his sentence? What did the parents do? Or Olivia? She once mentioned that some doctor told her parents that the odds of someone getting the same combination of syndromes that came together to make Augie's face were like 1 in 4 million. So doesn't that make the universe a giant lottery then? You purchase a ticket when you're born and it's all just random, whether you get a good ticket or a bad ticket. It's all just luck. My head swirls on this, but then softer thoughts soothe like a flatted third on a major chord. No, it's not all that random. If it really was all random, the universe would abandon us completely. And the universe doesn't. It takes care of its most fragile creations in ways we cannot see, like with parents who adore you blindly. And right now he's talking about the boy August, right? So, like with parents who adore you blindly, and a big sister who feels guilty for being human over you, and a little voiced kid whose friends have left him over you, and even a pink haired girl who carries your picture in her wallet, who was his sister's friend. And it may be a lottery, but the universe makes it all even out in the end, and the universe takes care of all of its birds. So, because you don't know the whole story, it might not make sense to you. But the idea is that even if a person is not religious and they don't have God in the picture, right? But everybody questions these things. It's a philosophical question. Why do humans suffer? Okay? To get to the answer, it's something, you need to think about it, you need to experience it, and you need to, I think, perhaps maybe write an essay on it. And that's probably where I'm probably going to give you an assignment on this. Okay? So, okay, now we're going to begin with human origins, which is when revelation and science conflict. When there's no conflict between science and revelation, तो मसला नहीं है. मसला कब क्रिएट होता है? जब एक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट आता है दोनों चीजों में. So page number, well, there's no page number for this. Package का कोई page number नहीं, but right after your free will and predestination reading, you have the human origins reading. So if you can take that out, please. Theological conclusions and empirical limitations. This one. You cannot see the whiteboard? Okay, so what is the introduction? Human beings endowed with the faculties of reason and sensory perception are able to accumulate a great amount of knowledge through observation and examination of the natural world. Indeed, the Quran draws its attention to this, stating, "And Allah has extracted you from the wombs of your mothers, not knowing a thing, and He made for you hearing and vision and intellect, that perhaps you would be grateful." The human faculties of reason, yani aql, and perception, which is hiss in the Arabic language, are tremendously powerful, and the Quran emphasizes the need for intellectual investigation no less than 750 times. So intellectual investigation, aap keh lein. around 750 times in the Quran. Now, the natural sciences are based upon this very synthesis of reason and perception into a comprehensive methodology of empirical investigation. For every true science must have supporting proofs, barahin, that are ultimately rooted in either sense perception or the dictates of reason. Okay, now there are three, you can call them scientists or you can call them thinkers, but one of them is Ibn Sina, who's also known as Avicenna, right? Ibn Sina, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah. If you look at page number 4, the last paragraph, one group has attempted to jettison all traditional theological commitments in favor of a wholesale embrace of the conclusions of evolutionists. Through radical gymnastics, hermeneutical gymnastics, they have claimed to unearth specific Quranic passages that allegedly discuss natural selection and other similar concepts. Not only does this compromise the truth value of the scripture such that it becomes infinitely malleable. So why is it a problem? If, for example, Ibn Sina, he takes reason as the most important thing. And what he says is that you can mold the Quranic ayahs according to whatever science is saying. Okay? Why does that become an issue? Because in essence, then you can infinitely change anything in the Quran to mean whatever you desire. Okay? So whatever comes into your mind, you can, take the eyes of the Quran and cause them to mean what you want them to mean. Okay? So ये इस वजह से criticize हुआ था काफी ज़्यादा. Although we know them as I mean, he's known in history. How do you write it? Avicenna, I don't know how to write it. The spelling. What did Ghazali say? Basically, revelation and logic go hand in hand. Okay? Logic or aql. Revelation is not, you're not going to find anything in Revelation that goes against your aql or logic. You may not be able to understand it, but it should be according to your aql, to reason. A better word is again reason here. What has been sorely needed, and thus far, this is the last paragraph on page 5, what has been sorely needed and thus far missing is a critical evaluation and academic engagement that attempts to integrate scripture and science. Such an approach would entail acknowledging the credibility of the scientific research while criticizing pseudo-scientific excesses in the public domain. It would also entail a deeper reflection on the precise theological conclusions that can be derived from Islamic scripture on humanity's origins. Now, okay, let me skip a little bit. So remember when we talked about Aqidah, in the last class. Aqidah is your belief or your creed. There's another word, kalam or ilmul kalam, which is literally discourse in the Arabic language. Okay? So ilmul kalam is what the scholars carried out discourse or discussion in order to sort of answer back, different aqidas, you can say. Okay? So for example, philosophy or Hellenistic philosophy posed certain questions, right? And now the Islamic scholars gave answers to them. And that process is known as ilmul kalam. Okay, so they carried out discourses, they tried to give their own answers or replies to what was being said. So in this world of ilmul kalam, we find Ibn Sina and Ghazali, page number 8, the last paragraph. Ibn Sina represents the tradition of the falasifa and he viewed philosophical reasoning as represented by Neoplatonic and Aristotelian traditions as the supreme discourse in ascertaining the truths of reality. In his work Kitab al-Shifa, he describes the role of prophets as essential for social order. The role of the prophet is to communicate philosophical truths about the divine in the language of symbols that will be comprehensible to the masses. So what he says essentially is that everything has been described as a symbol. So even heaven and hell are symbols. So he's saying that they are not really realities in the sense that they're described. You can't take them literally. This is what he is saying, okay? And he's saying they're symbolic descriptions for common people to imagine. Takhil means to imagine realities beyond their comprehension. Ibn Sina affirms only a spiritual resurrection, signifying either permanent mental pleasure or misery in the soul. अब अगर देखा जाए तो it's just, you know, semantics अगर देखा जाए, because a lot of people do take it like that, that it is the soul that will continue, right? Whether you have a physical body or not, you know that the soul is the thing that will live on. At least this physical body won't live on. Okay, whether you have another one, we don't know that. So he's taking that information and he's saying that the soul is there that is going to eternally survive, right? And because that is something which we don't understand, that spiritual resurrection will be in a place, in a time and place which is also spiritual, right? And you don't really have to take it materially the way that we think. This is what he's saying. So he says that the religious texts that conflict with philosophical truth are to be interpreted as allegorical, symbolic, and ultimately, well, now he's taking it to a level of fiction. That's where it becomes sort of problematic. That's where he's been criticized by Islamic scholars, that if you're saying it's fiction, or if you end up saying that Quran is fiction, then how do you know something is true? Okay, that is the point. This is page number 9, the very first line, very first word is philosophical truth are to be interpreted as allegorical, symbolic, and ultimately, somebody's mic is on. Okay. So he's saying there are no, the author is saying that there are no hermeneutic limits to this approach. One could extend this method to argue that prayer, fasting, and even the concept of God are mere symbols. Indeed, in Europe, the naturalist philosopher Benedict de Spinoza reduced God to a productive force in nature and dismissed most of religion. For many, arguing that for many things are narrated in scripture as real and were believed to be real, which are in fact symbolic and imaginary. Can you please not whisper to each other in class, because it's very distracting. If you need to say something, you guys can easily walk out. I never stop anyone from walking out. You can take a break and then come back. Okay. Can you guys see the whiteboard or not? I didn't make Zainab the co-host. Okay. All right, so the Hanbalite theology, you still don't know what a Hanbali is. We're gonna do this when we do law. This is one of the schools of thought of fiqh, of law basically, right? So the Hanbali theologian, Al-Safarani explicitly criticized this method of dealing with the texts. They say that what the Prophet mentioned on the subject of faith and the afterlife is only a symbolic representation of the truths to benefit the masses, not to actually clarify reality nor guide creation to elaborate truths, and there is no disbelief greater than this disbelief. The preceding approach was categorically rejected by mainstream Muslim scholarship, and many of its most vociferous opponents belong to the tradition of Kalam. So Imam Ghazali is actually from the tradition of Ilm al-Kalam, which sought a synthesis of Hellenistic philosophy with scriptural interpretation. In this tradition, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali argued that since reason is the basis for affirming the truth of revelation, as logic alone distinguishes between a true prophet and a false one. Reason cannot be discarded when it appears to conflict with revelation. So again, even if there is a conflict between reason and revelation, you're not going to say that we're not going to listen to reason. You're not going to put that in the bin. Okay? Reason cannot be discarded. In his work Qanun al-Ta'wil, he argues that the moderate position is to accept both reason and revelation as important foundations. And in cases of apparent conflict, such as hadiths describing actions being weighed. So you do have hadiths that say that actions will be weighed. What does that mean? How can actions be, how can they have a weight, and how can they be weighed, right? Or death being slaughtered. So what is that? That is again that is actually said to be an allegorical statement, that death will be slaughtered on the day of judgment, i.e. nobody is going to die after that. That was just a phenomenon on this earth. Okay? So what does that mean, death being slaughtered? There is no recourse except to metaphorical interpretation in this case. Okay? The default presumption with regards to a scripture is to affirm that it describes things as they actually are. So what is the default position? To describe things as they are. Matlab, you're not going to go towards a metaphorical explanation if you can take the actual literal explanation, right? But if that's not possible, yani wujud jis tarah us cheez ka hai, wujud-e-zati means the way that things actually are, right? It is only when this level of interpretation conflicts with a logical deductive argument that one resorts to metaphorical interpretation, which Ahlul Kalam primarily applied to texts pertaining to the attributes of God. So who are the Ahlul Kalam? The people of Kalam, right? Ahl means the people of discourse, the people of Ilmul Kalam. So the Ahlul Kalam, i.e. the people who were discoursing about Aqidah, about creed, they applied this to the attributes of God, right? So all the attributes of God that we know, we're going to use metaphorical interpretation in that. And there's one book by Imam Ghazali as well, The 99 Beautiful Names of God. While a particular word or phrase in a text could be taken as metaphor, none of the schools of Kalam considered the accounts of the hereafter or the prophets to be wholly allegorical. Okay? Okay, now the third person is Ibn Taymiyyah, and he argues for the primacy of revelation and presents a law which is the inverse of that provided by the Kalam theologians. He says that when reason and revelation contradict, giving priority to reason would logically entail that it not be given priority. So he's saying, essentially, let's say, assume कि आप logic को priority दे रहे हैं. He's saying that you will deduce from this that logic should not be given priority. Okay? Why is he saying this? If logic establishes the veracity of the scripture, so using your logic and reasoning, you have come to accept that this scripture has not changed in the times of the prophet, and it is miraculous. If you are accepting that veracity of the scripture, then the only logical conclusion is to accept what the scripture states unconditionally and without challenging it on the basis of fallible and fundamentally limited human reasoning. So he's saying our own logic gives rise to keeping revelation above our own reason, because we know that our reason is limited. Okay? Acha. The truth of revelation does require external verification, but is actually recognized through its concordance with the primordial nature of all human beings. So here's the mention of fitra coming up again, right? Human nature of fitra is to know God. So everybody knows God in their own selves, in their fitra, rather than through convoluted philosophical arguments. You don't really always need philosophical arguments to believe in God. Again, that's why you call it a belief. It's something that people believe in, right? And that's different. अब जब ये belief की बात आ रही है, that's where we're gonna also mention philosophical science, right? Or science की philosophy. Usually we think that it doesn't have philosophy, right? That there's no philosophy in science. So this is what we're going to discuss now, the authors. So he says that it is actually the fitra, or the nature of all human beings, that accept God. Moreover, Ibn Taymiyyah rejects the oft-mentioned bipartite division of knowledge into religious and rational. He doesn't divide them. He doesn't say religious knowledge is separate from rational knowledge. He says they're one and the same thing, arguing that reason is intrinsic to religion. He explains that what is relevant is the definitive qat'i nature of a proof. This is coming up again, and it's going to come up again when we're doing law. Remember, I mentioned this before. What is qat'i is what is definitive. Jo pakka hai, theek hai? And this can be in the Quran, it can be in the Hadith. So if there is a proof in the Quran which is categorized as qat'i or as definitive, regardless of whether it is scriptural or rational, or it could be even a rational proof, okay? A rational proof which is definitive. There could be other rational proofs which are not definitive, they're probable. We might have different opinions about them, but then there are some truths that we rationally conclude and everybody agrees on them, okay? They are definitive. When it comes to textual evidences which are explicit and unequivocal, there can be no recourse to reinterpretation. However, if revelation provides us with a lone text that is ambiguous or subject to interpretation and has several possible readings, while reason is conclusive on a matter, then we have no qualms adopting the linguistically plausible reading of the text that is concordant with the dictates of reason and modern science. Okay? So in this situation, you can take that other meaning. Okay? Ek obvious literal meaning hai. You can take another meaning if it goes in accordance with reason as well as modern science. This is not a case of figurative interpretation, but rather selecting one of a variety of established lexical meanings of a word based on definitive proofs. So for instance, 6 days in the Arabic language, okay, it's mentioned that the earth was made in 6 days, the heavens and the earth. The Arabic word yawm, which means one day, could mean one day, also can mean any period of time. Okay? Hence, to understand this verse as implying that Allah created the heavens and earth in 6 stages rather than in 6 days, then we have to accept that this is what Allah intended for us to believe. Okay. Why did it? I think maybe I don't know how it got muted. How long has it been muted, by the way? Okay. Okay, so yeah, so 6 days can also be considered 6 stages. Okay, because the word yawm in the Arabic language can mean one day also, but it's used for the 24-hour period as we know it, or it could mean a time period. So it's completely in harmony with the Quran to say that the heavens and the earth were created in 6 stages rather than 24-hour periods. Okay, so how do these 3 approaches, these were 3 approaches Ibn Sina, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah proposed. Okay, how are these 3 approaches how do they pertain to the topic of evolution? In the case of the story of human origins, we have such an explicit narrative, one that is deeply rooted in countless passages throughout the entire Quran and numerous prophetic statements, that there is no choice other than to accept that this is what Allah intended for us to believe. So what is the issue here is that there are explicit statements in the scripture, ठीक है? और बहुत दफा आती हैं, repeat होती हैं, and all of them are saying one thing, ठीक है, which is that Adam alayhi salam was the first man to be created, and Allah created him from his own hand. And so how are we going to take those and look at evolution? So there is no choice other than to accept that this is what Allah intended for us to believe. The sheer quantity and diversity of nouns adjectives, and verbs used simply makes any linguistic reinterpretation impossible. Why is it impossible to reinterpret this? Because all of the verbs and the nouns, and every time it is mentioned in the Quran, in the scripture, or in the hadith, it doesn't make sense to reinterpret them. ठीक है, क्योंकि अगर एक जगह एक हदीस आ रही है और उसमें एक चीज मेंशन्ड है, आप उसको तो कर सकते हैं, उसका मेटाफोर ले सकते हैं, आप कह सकते हैं maybe this was intended and etc, right? But because there's so many instances in which this is mentioned and then different nouns are used, different verbs are used, and all of them are pertaining to one clear message that doesn't seem to be, it's not possible to sort of reinterpret it, right? And to mean something else completely. So meanwhile, attempts to describe the entire account as symbolic or allegorical may be tempting for some contemporary Muslim scientists, but it leads to logically incoherent theological ramifications and contradicts the Quran's own emphasis that these accounts are literally true narratives. Developing an epistemologically sound foundation upon which both scriptural and scientific truths work in concert is a far more fruitful endeavor. Okay? So it's better not to sort of think that it's metaphorically stated. Rather, we need to sort of combine both science and scripture. Okay, so one way that the authors do that is the domino effect. Okay, you will have to read this on your own. We'll go to page number 14, misrepresenting this philosophy of science. How does science work? What can it tell us and what can't it tell us? The philosophical dimension of scientific investigation is often neglected, but it's critically important to understand the role science plays, how it develops, and how to draw cogent conclusions from empirical data. The philosopher and evolutionist Daniel Dennett has written, scientists sometimes deceive themselves into thinking that philosophical ideas are only at best decorations. Why is he saying that? Okay, let's read the whole thing first. So objective triumphs of science and that they themselves are immune to the confusions that philosophers devote their lives to dissolving. But there is no such thing as philosophy-free science. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. So what is he saying here? On page 14, quotation by the scientist. Gee, anyone online as well? He's saying there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. जी anyone? अच्छा ये एक और आप कर लें, एक और पढ़ लें जो इसके एंड पर है, पेज 14 के एंड पर एक और कोटेशन है. रॉजर पेनरोज stated, I don't demand that a theory correspond to reality because I don't know what it is. Reality is not a quality you can test with litmus paper. All I'm concerned with is that the theory should predict the results of measurements. Quantum theory does this very successfully. जी ये जो थोड़ा बहुत, I'm not going to ask you about scientific realism, but you do need to understand the argument by knowing what they're saying. So when they're saying scientific realism, just this paragraph between these two quotations, right? Scientific realism sees science as an enterprise involved in deriving literally true descriptions about what reality is and what we should believe. क्या कह रहा है science? I mean, basically realism ये चीज है कि what is real, right? Reality क्या चीज है and you're trying to describe it. So literally true descriptions reality की जो है वो scientific realism sees that as their arena. And on the other hand, the school of scientific anti-realism maintains that the point of a scientific theory is to fit existing data and observations. Okay, so Stephen Hawking, who was a physicist, he promoted an anti-realist viewpoint because he's saying that you have a scientific theory and that should fit in existing data and observations. Okay, instead of sort of having these observations and then using them to describe reality. Okay, because you see what he's doing is that he understands that when you observe something, your perception of it or your understanding of it, and you're trying to make sense of reality through it, is going to be a process that may be different. It may not be qat'i, it may not be definitive, it may be probable. So one person is saying one thing, another person is looking at it in another way and taking a different conclusion out of it. Okay. Page number 15, middle of that paragraph. When it comes, this is, I think, the 8th line from the top, seventh line. When it comes to things that are directly observable, then empirical adequacy becomes the same as truth. As for matters that are unobservable, then we rely on interpretations, inferences, models, extrapolations, and postulations that aim only to be empirically adequate. What he's going to argue now is that you cannot go back in time and you cannot observe the making of Hazrat Adam alayhi salam. Okay? That's not scientifically observable. So whatever you're going to say about that time, it's going to be a theory. You're going to be philosophizing about it. Say it? This is essentially what he's going to say. And then they're also saying, understanding the fundamentals of human nature, page number 16. बल्कि इससे पहले वाला भी देख लें जो पैराग्राफ है, just right above it, the conclusion of what we were talking about, page 16, the top paragraph. In constructing theories about what took place at an unseen time hundreds of thousands of years ago, we can only make inferences based on interpretations of the data that have survived until today. We cannot design an experiment that could reach back thousands of years and directly determine what took place. Moreover, in this next section, we will explore how even the available empirical data, when carefully considered, requires a more robust ontological narrative of human origins than that offered by naturalism. Okay? So now they're going to look at human nature itself. And they're saying the world of academia, actually. I'm not sure. Does anyone know what word this is? Is this French word? Ji? Page number 16. Hai. Page number 16. The world of, I thought it would be academia, but it's an E at the end only. Chale, I thought maybe somebody can let us know quickly. The ones online are not responding. और मैं ये सोच रही हूँ कि आप लोग रमजान में और मैं भी रमजान में इस टाइम पे सो रही होंगी. So like, do you guys want it to be right after Sehri, right after Suhoor? I think that would be much easier for all of us. In Ramadan, we still have classes like at least till the last 1/3, even longer than that, I think. Iftari ke baad is like we'll be sleeping at that time also, I think, right after eating. So right after Suhoor would be like 6:30ish, I think. And I think online kar len, campus pe aana, I don't want to come to campus. Okay? I want to go to sleep after Suhoor. So like right after Sehri, we have a class online for everyone. And then, yeah, after Sehri, yes. Okay, so like, online it's okay. So I'm taking their opinion, their vote on it. After Sehri nahi hoga, to phir 8:30 kaun uthega? Rida se sawal. So I'm asking Rida, how in the world are we going to wake up at 8:30 after having slept after Suhoor, after Sehri? I won't be able to do that. Trust me. I stay awake till Suhoor. We still have 2 months for that, but it's already on my mind. So like, acha. So here's what they say. Let's just quickly end this, and I want to show you a small video which will inshallah wake you up. मैं बीच में वैसे दिखाना चाह रही थी, but then this will sort of completely detract us. ठीक है, तो language page number 18 में देखें. First is language. So what they're going to look at now is the fact that what are human beings essentially? The gift of language is one of the most fascinating features of the human species. In the Quran, it's mentioned immediately after the creation of the human being as a divinely endowed faculty. Ar-Rahman allamahul Quran allamahul bayan, right? Created the human. Sorry. Khalaq al-insan allamahul bayan. So created the human being and taught him language or bayan. So bayan means essentially to express something, explain something, elaborate on something. Bayan, okay? And interestingly, there is this research. If you study even John Holt, who talks a lot about homeschooling Kele or how children learn. He has a book, How Children Learn. He has a book, Learning All the Time. So ये जो इसके ऊपर जो सारी research है ना, it's amazing how we learn our mother language. Okay, so you look at a toddler and you're not teaching them any rules of language, any rules of grammar. You're not teaching them adverbs or nouns. I mean, you're not teaching them all these terms as well. Okay, grammar आप उनको नहीं सिखा रहे, but what they do essentially is they listen and they record and they make sense of it. And it's miraculous, and we don't realize how miraculous it is. So learning the mother language is very different from learning a second or a third language. Okay, second, third language में आपने सारे rules पढ़ने हैं, और file क्या है, मफूल क्या है, who's the doer, what is the adverb, who is doing the action, what is noun, adjectives, all of that. ठीक है, तो ये जो first यानी आपके लिए first language के साथ होता है वो miraculous है. ठीक है, so who is teaching us that? Allah is saying it is Ar-Rahman, it is Allah who teaches us bayan or language. ठीक है, by stringing together a few sounds or written symbols, and also that's why it's said that you shouldn't really correct a child because they correct themselves. ठीक है, yani for example, they get something wrong, and the next time you're going to say something like, even with your masks on, I know who's talking, by the way. It's very easy to tell. Achha. So like one child makes a mistake, okay? Even if you don't correct them, the next time that adults are talking, they're going to correct themselves. So for example, my 2-year-old used to say hamka, okay? That's a very common thing that kids say. Hamara ko they just say hamka because that makes more sense logically speaking, right? Because hamara, I mean, hamara is a completely new word, right? But hamka is a combination of us and like ours. You get that? I guess, yeah. So and the way they pick that up is amazing. So he's saying an observation which led to the description of an innate faculty called the language acquisition device, one of Noam Chomsky's pioneering conceptual innovations in the field of linguistics. Many of these, I sort of skipped the first part, which I was explaining. Human toddlers are able to acquire such knowledge naturally with astoundingly minimal instruction. Okay? Next sentence, many of these rules are actually quite complex and difficult to ascertain, even with considerable study, and yet native speakers can identify them instinctively. The human mind's preparedness to learn language in distinction to all other animals is now commonly acknowledged, but was articulated in the classical work of Ibn al-Qayyim, who argued that God is the one who prepared the mind of the human by making it amenable to learning language, in contrast to all other animals. Many people make the error of considering language to be a system of communication that is simply a few orders of magnitude superior to animal communication. However, the communicative aspect of language is peripheral to its primary function as a system of thought, serving to analyze and clarify concepts, construct ideas, explicate, and can you please, I think maybe you were dozing off when I said कि जब आप लोग बात करते हैं तो it really distracts the teacher. So अगर आप लोग मतलब थोड़ा सा break चाहिए हो तो थोड़ा सा round लेके बेशक आ जाए, but please don't talk in class, ठीक है? Okay, so however, the communicative aspect of language is peripheral to its primary function as a system of thought, serving to analyze and clarify concepts, construct ideas, explicate and pose questions. Okay, why is it asking me to restart? Um, an elaborate meaning. Linguistic conceptions are intrinsic to our mental activity, and internal train of thought cannot dispense with words. So, can you guys think of a thought? Think of a thought without using any words. Something, anything, kuch soche, but without using words. I think some of are more visual in nature, and for them it's easier because then you can just visualize without having to think of words. So anyway, but he's saying try to think of a thought without any words. The Quran identifies this as the fundamental character of language and also distinguishes between the language faculty itself and individual languages. Okay, so I'll skip a little bit and then what is the second thing that they're going to talk about is consciousness, page number 23. The second thing that one of the most obvious ways in which human beings transcend animal capacities is with regards to their mental activities and the content of their thoughts. The idea that we can imagine and think of things that are not there. So fantasy, sci-fi, just thinking of things which are not there, or thinking maybe of perfection, you can also say, okay? Looking for perfection and thinking of it. This is the second thing, and then other differences, and then at the end, they're going to talk about evolutionary science versus evolutionist dogma. What is the conclusion? The rest you do have to read on your own, but the conclusion is Islamic theology is explicit on the origin of human beings from Adam and Eve, with such diverse, unequivocal textual evidences that countenance no figurative reinterpretation. It is a mistake for Muslims to presume theology and ontology must play second fiddle to empirical science, or to retreat to a safe space, leaving only science to comment on important matters of human origins. This mistake fails to see how philosophy is intertwined with science and how theology provides a unique and profound understanding of human origins. It is also a mistake for Muslims to make the blanket statement, we don't believe in evolution. Quite the contrary, the empirical data and fundamental principles of biological evolution are not excluded by Islamic theology, provided that we acknowledge that the mechanisms of evolution occur solely by the divine will. As a basic invocation teaches us, there is no change or even power to change except with Allah. ठीक है? अच्छा, एक point, दो तीन point, इसके बाद मैं आपको वीडियो दिखाती हूँ. जो एक point हमने बीच में नहीं पढ़ा वो था the domino effect. The authors are going to argue that even if you take all of the scientific data and say that evolution did happen in a way, how are you going to answer? Because different scholars answer it in different ways. They're saying that you can say that domino effect agar ek hota hai. Let's suppose you put all these dominoes and they start falling, or ek point pe aap ek domino uthate before it has fallen, you pick it up and you replace it with another one, ठीक है, और फिर वो गिर जाता है. When you look at that, it will look as if that domino was already there and it was ये cause and effect होता गया और वो गिर गया. But you were the one who put it there. यानी आपने interfere किया है, उस process में आपने interfere किया है, ठीक है? So they're essentially saying that God interfered in that, and that's where he put down Adam alayhi salam onto the earth. Okay, that's one thing that they're saying. Another important thing is that asal cheez ye that there's no change or even power to change except with Allah. Evolutionary science is not bad science. So some people go to one extreme and say ke bas humne isko lena hi nahi hai. Like we don't have to study, like Muslims don't have to study certain types of science. However, they're saying, and perhaps it's the right way to go, that we are all for science, right? The only thing is when scripture is conflicting with science, we're going to take scripture and try to, what are we going to do? What are they saying? We're going to bridge the gap. We're going to put both of them together and try to make sense of it in that way so that there is no conflict left. Acha. So Nora, is it a Western anti-religious conspiracy, which people like to point out, that seeks to transform Muslims into godless heathens? Rather, it is a well-researched scientific model that fits the criterion of proper science, but it also has the limitations that any scientific theory has. Just to realize that science also has limitations, okay? In particular, the distinctions of human, actually, हमारे लिए शायद इतना बड़ा मसला नहीं है, but if you go abroad and you do talk to people who are in their undergrad studies, उनको जिस तरह से philosophy और science पढ़ाई जाती है, particularly science or evolution theory, वो ऐसे है कि जैसे ये belief है, like इतना strong belief है कि आप उससे बाहर निकल ही नहीं सकते. यानी this is how much that's how, where they've put science. They've sort of put it on a pedestal where we put revelation, they've put science. Okay? So this is something that they're bringing, and not all of them, like for example, anti-realist scientists realize this mistake that people are making, right? So this is what they're saying at the end, that it is a well-researched scientific model that fits the criterion of proper science, but it also has the limitations that any scientific theory has. In particular, the distinctions of humankind warrant a solid ontological foundation that philosophical naturalism fails to provide. An integrative approach to studying both scriptural and scientific science, ayat, furnishes precisely such a foundation and yields a deeper appreciation of who we are and to whom we shall return. Acha. So we do have 5 minutes if I can quickly Google it. Now, this is actually tying into both जो हम बात कर रहे थे, free will and predestination की बात कर रहे थे, and tying into sort of change जो अभी हमने बात किया है. Change can be in any form, but the idea that we can change is very important. And okay, I need to share this with blame. Yeah, I think this is the one. Just let me share this. Okay, so those of you who are online, let me know if you can see this. Power of vulnerability, no, it should be supposed to be blame, but maybe it's the same. Nope. Supposed to be just 3 minutes long. Yeah, this one. Can they see it?
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Renee. I'm a blamer.
Sorry. Glitches sometimes. There's so many glitches. It's because of my laptop as well.
Whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Renee. I'm a blamer. I'll just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple of years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I'm on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this, damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10 because you can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back up at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had me come home when we discussed. Therefore, and the rest of the story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that's still all like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, This is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no, 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 no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we spend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in a place where I was making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
Okay, so you can listen to that again at home, because there are a lot of points she mentioned, which are all important. And I want you to make that connection between sort of, you know, when we're talking about free will and predestination, a lot of times we jump to that. We sort of start blaming God for what is, whereas instead of looking for the wisdoms behind something being the way it is. One thing is that. Another thing is, this is Dr. Brené Brown. If I don't know if anybody has read her. Her first book was Gifts of Imperfection, but I don't have that. I read that on PDF. Gifts of Imperfection, I think, is one book which everyone should read, because we talked about perfection and how human beings are imperfect, and it sort of gives you that baseline, for which I might, again, that assignment that has been coming into my mind, inshallah, when I give that, I want you guys to be thinking about these themes that we've talked about. Gifts of imperfection of human beings. Why were human beings created? Angels were perfect. Why were human beings created with these imperfections, right? So her book, Gifts of Imperfection, is one of the first things that I would recommend. If you guys can look for it, I don't know if it's available anywhere. I don't have it, unfortunately, but I have her other 3 books. So one of them is Rising Strong. This is her 3rd book, I think. And again, we'll end here. It's already 9:46. Because then the next class has to come in. So we'll end our class here, and then next week we will be, so what we've done till today is in the quiz, okay? True Nature of Prophecy, जो आपका next 3rd module में है, वो हम शुरू करेंगे next time. So yeah, the 2nd module, Islam and Philosophy में True Nature of Prophecy हम शुरू कर देंगे Friday को इंशाल्लाह. And I will let you know if I am intending to, I will probably include that in the quiz actually also. So please do start reading. Human Origins में हमने mostly cover कर लिया है, but you have to read carefully the domino effect and some of the things that we skipped. ठीक है? See you next week inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.